He lived a life built on quiet habits. Every morning began the same way. He woke before the alarm, washed his face with cold water, and stood for a moment at the bathroom sink, staring at a man who looked older than he felt. His hair had thinned at the temples. Fine lines rested around his eyes, not from laughter but from years of holding things in. He dressed in simple clothes, made plain coffee, and ate without tasting it. Nothing in his days was loud. Nothing demanded too much from him. And that was exactly how he had learned to survive. He worked, came home, watched the evening news with the volume low, and slept. On weekends he cleaned what was already clean. He fixed what did not need fixing. He avoided mirrors that showed more than his face. He avoided thoughts that asked difficult questions. Loss had shaped him early. He never spoke about it, not because he had healed, but because silence felt safer than remembering. Silence had become a habit. And like all habits, it had hardened into routine. The house he stood in now was not really his anymore. It had belonged to his parents. The walls still held their voices, though the rooms had gone quiet. The furniture was older than it looked, worn smooth by years of use and care. Every object seemed to carry a story he had never asked to hear. He was here because of death. A parent's death had a strange way of rearranging time. It made the past feel closer than the present. It forced open doors long kept shut. Legal papers, inheritance forms, boxes pulled from closets. Things that had been ignored now demanded attention. That was how he found the Bible. It sat on the highest shelf of a narrow wooden bookcase in the hallway. Thick, heavy, bound in dark leather, cracked at the corners. Dust clung to its edges like it had been waiting. He remembered it from childhood. It had always been there. Always visible. Always untouched. No one ever read from it out loud. No one ever moved it. It was not a book of belief, at least not in the way people usually meant. It was more like a marker. A symbol. Proof that something important had once mattered deeply to someone in the family. His grandparents had kept it, then his parents. And now, somehow, it had fallen to him. He hesitated before pulling it down. It felt wrong to open it. Like crossing a line he had been taught not to see. Some things he believed were meant to stay closed, not because they were dangerous but because they carried weight. Still he was sorting through the house. Deciding what to keep. What to give away. What to let go. The Bible was part of that decision. When he lifted it, he was surprised by how heavy it was. Not just the pages. The feeling. The years pressed into it. He carried it to the dining table and set it down carefully as if it might break. The room was quiet. Late afternoon light slipped through the curtains, turning dust into floating gold. The air smelled faintly of old wood and paper. He rested his hand on the cover. For a moment he considered putting it back. Then he opened it. The pages were thin and yellowed, soft with age. The words were small and tight, printed in a style that belonged to another time. He did not read them. He flipped slowly, respectfully, unsure what he was looking for. Halfway through, something stopped him. A page near the front was thicker than the others. He turned back. It was the family record section. He recognized the layout instantly. Names. Dates. Headings for births, marriages, deaths. The ink had faded in places, but the writing was careful and neat. This was not printed text. This was handwriting. His family's handwriting. He leaned closer. He saw names he knew. Grandparents. Great-grandparents. Dates he remembered from gravestones and old conversations. It was a quiet list of beginnings and endings, written without emotion, without commentary. And then his breath caught. There were entries he did not recognize. Not new names, but new writing. Different handwriting. Sharper. More deliberate. Dates that did not match any memory he carried. His fingers trembled slightly as he turned the page. More notes appeared in the margins. Small marks. Lines drawn carefully, as if someone had returned to these pages again and again. A cold unease settled in his chest. This Bible had not been resting. It had been used. Recently. He scanned the page once more, trying to make sense of what he was seeing, when his eyes landed on a name that made his stomach tighten. His own. Written clearly. Fully. Exactly as it appeared on his birth certificate. Below it was a date. And beside that date was a word that did not belong to the living. His heart began to race, slow and heavy at the same time. The room felt smaller. The Bible rested open in front of him, no longer a quiet heirloom, but something awake. Something waiting. And in that moment, he understood one thing with frightening clarity. This book had never been meant to stay closed. He stared at the page, certain he had misunderstood what he was seeing. His name sat there in plain ink, written carefully without flourish. Not a nickname. Not an abbreviation. His full name exactly as it had always been recorded. It was neat, intentional, as if whoever wrote it wanted there to be no doubt. Below it was a date, and next to the date was a word that made his chest tighten. Funeral. For a moment his mind went blank. The air in the room felt thin as if it had been pulled away without warning. He closed the Bible slowly, then opened it again, convinced the words would rearrange themselves when he looked a second time. They didn't. He leaned back in the chair and forced himself to breathe. One breath, then another. There's a mistake, he thought. It was the only thing that made sense. A clerical error. Someone else with the same name. A strange coincidence that only looked personal because he wanted it to. He leaned forward again and studied the page more carefully. The entries above and below his name followed a clear pattern. Births were listed first, then marriages, then deaths. Dates were written with the same careful structure. Nothing was out of place, except him. He was listed among the dead. He checked the date again. It wasn't far off, just weeks away. His stomach dropped. He shook his head, a small, sharp movement as if that might loosen the thought from his mind. People didn't predict funerals. Families didn't write these things ahead of time. It went against logic, against sense. He flipped back a few pages and forward again, searching for anything that explained it. Maybe it was a symbolic note. Maybe the word meant something else, something old or misunderstood. But the handwriting was modern, clean, familiar in a way that made his skin prickle. He traced the ink lightly with his finger, stopping just before touching his name. This can't be real, he told himself. Still he could not close the book. A strange feeling crept over him, not full panic, not yet, but something colder. Something steady. Like standing on the edge of deep water and realizing you don't know how far it drops. He thought of explanations. Someone had played a cruel joke. Someone had written it as a warning. Someone had meant to erase it and never did. Each answer felt weaker than the last. His eyes moved again to the date. It was close enough to feel personal. Close enough to feel intentional. The quiet of the house pressed in around him. He became aware of every sound, the faint ticking of a clock, the hum of electricity in the walls, his own breathing louder than it should have been. Time felt heavier now. Measured. He tried to laugh it off, but the sound came out thin and false. It echoed briefly in the empty room and disappeared. This was ridiculous, he told himself. He wasn't sick. He felt fine. He had plans. A life that moved forward even if slowly. And yet, the thought he tried not to think slipped in anyway. What if this wasn't a mistake? What if it was meant to be found now? A chill ran through him. Not fear alone, but something else, something deeper. A strange sense that this moment had been waiting for him. He looked again at the surrounding entries. Other names. Other dates. All of them already passed. All of them real. These weren't guesses. These were records. He wondered who had written them. When. And why. His pulse quickened. He pressed his palm against his chest, grounding himself in the solid fact of his heartbeat. He was here. Alive. Breathing. Still, the date sat there, calm and unmoving as if it did not care what he believed. He closed the Bible, this time more firmly, and stood up. The chair scraped softly against the floor, the sound too loud in the silence. He paced the room once, then again. "Don't let this get to you," he muttered, though no one was there to hear it. But it already had. From that moment on, the date followed him. It hovered at the edge of his thoughts as he moved through the house. As he washed his hands. As he locked the door. As he stood at the window and watched the light fade outside. He told himself he would forget it by morning. He knew he wouldn't. The Bible remained on the table, closed now but no longer harmless. It felt like a presence, like something unfinished. And deep inside, beneath denial and reason, a quiet question began to form, one he was not ready to face. What if the date wasn't predicting his death? What if it was demanding something from him before it arrived? The thought lingered as night fell, uneasy and unresolved, pulling him toward answers he did not yet know how to seek. Sleep did not come easily that night. When it finally did, it brought fragments instead of rest, half memories, old rooms, voices without faces. He woke before dawn with a dull ache behind his eyes and the same heavy thought sitting in his chest. The Bible. The date. His name. He got out of bed and went back to the dining table. The book was still there, exactly where he had left it. Closed. Waiting. He sat down and opened it again, more slowly this time. If the date was going to haunt him, then he needed to understand the hands that had written it. The past, he realized, had never really been past in this family. It had simply learned how to stay quiet. The Bible carried the smell of age, paper, leather, time. He turned the pages carefully, noticing things he had missed before. Small pencil marks in the margins. Faint underlines. Tiny symbols beside certain names. None of it felt random. As he read the family record pages again, memories began to rise. He saw his mother in the kitchen, moving through her day without complaint. She had been kind but careful. Her love was steady but rarely spoken. She showed it in meals prepared, clothes folded, lights turned off behind him. Words, especially heavy ones, had never been her way. His father had been even quieter. A man of routine. A man who believed that providing was enough, that feelings were things you handled alone. When grief entered the house, when people were lost, when arguments went unfinished, it settled into the walls instead of being named. No one talked about pain. No one asked hard questions. They endured. And before them there had been others. His grandparents lived in his memory like shadows, present but distant. His grandfather especially stood out now. A tall man with sharp eyes and a calm voice. He had gone to church every Sunday, carried his Bible carefully, and spoke only when he felt it mattered. He had believed in preparation, in responsibility, in leaving things in order. As a child, he remembered watching that Bible rest on the table after meals, untouched but respected. It had been treated less like a book and more like a witness. Now, turning the pages, he began to understand why. This Bible was not just scripture. It was a record, not only of faith but of lives, of choices, of endings. Each entry told a story without telling it. A birth date with no joy written beside it. A death date with no explanation, no emotion, just facts. Facts, he realized, were safer than feelings. As he studied the handwriting more closely, a pattern started to form. Older entries were written in a rounded, careful style. Newer ones were firmer, more deliberate. Someone had taken over the task. Someone had continued the tradition. The thought unsettled him. He had always believed his family avoided talking about death. Avoided acknowledging it until it arrived, then quickly moved on. But this book suggested something else entirely. They had been watching time, recording it, preparing for it. A quiet guilt crept in as he turned the pages. He thought of moments he had walked away from, calls he had not returned, words he had swallowed because they felt too uncomfortable to say. He remembered arguments left unresolved because silence was easier than repair. He remembered love he had not fought for. The date in the Bible had not created these regrets. It had only brought them into focus. He realized then how deeply he had inherited this silence. How naturally he had stepped into it like a role written long before he was born. He had learned to stay quiet, to endure, to move forward without looking back. But endurance, he was starting to see, came with a cost. The Bible closed softly beneath his hands as his thoughts drifted to the people he had lost. Not just to death but to distance, to time, to pride. How many moments had passed because no one wanted to break the silence? How many endings had come quietly without the chance for forgiveness? The weight of it pressed down on him, not as fear but as responsibility. If this book carried the record of lives lived and lives lost, then his name being written there was not random. It was part of something older than him. Something shaped by generations who believed preparation mattered more than comfort. And suddenly, the question was no longer just about the date. It was about what he had done with the years leading up to it. He sat there as morning light filled the room, understanding something that had always been true but never spoken aloud in his family. Silence could protect you, but it could also bury you. And now, with his name written in ink he did not recognize, he felt the quiet pulling back, forcing him to look, to remember, and to face what had been left undone. The Bible lay open before him, heavy with history. And for the first time he wondered if it was asking him to do what no one else ever had. Break the silence. He told himself he would approach this calmly. Reason had always been his shield. When things felt too heavy he broke them into smaller parts. Facts first. Feelings later, if ever. So that morning he cleared the dining table and laid everything out as if preparing for work. The Bible sat at the center. Around it he placed old folders pulled from drawers and boxes. Birth certificates, death notices, marriage records. He found envelopes yellowed with age, their edges soft from being handled too many times. He set out photographs next. Faces frozen in time, smiles stiff or uncertain, eyes that seemed to look past the camera. He began comparing. Handwriting first. He studied the older entries in the Bible, then the newer ones. He compared them to notes scribbled on letters, to signatures on documents. He leaned close, squinting, holding pages up to the light. Some lines matched. Some didn't. That uncertainty gnawed at him. He checked dates next. cross-referenced them with official records. Most aligned perfectly. Too perfectly. The sense of unease deepened. This wasn't random. It wasn't careless. Whoever wrote in this Bible had taken time. They had been precise. He flipped back to his own entry. His name. That date. That word. Funeral. His chest tightened again, sharper this time. He closed his eyes and pressed his fingers into his temples. This was getting out of hand, he thought. He needed air. Space. But instead of leaving the house, he put on his coat and drove to the cemetery. He hadn't planned to. The decision came quietly, as if it had already been made. The cemetery was calm in the late morning light. Rows of stones stood in silent order, names etched deep and clean. He walked slowly, hands in his pockets, reading dates without meaning to. Born. Died. Born. Died. The simplicity of it felt cruel. He found his parents' graves and stood there longer than he expected. The ground was still neat, recently tended. He wondered who would stand here for him one day. Who would say his name out loud? The thought made his throat tighten. Back home, the search continued. He pulled out old photo albums and flipped through them page by page. Birthday gatherings. Holiday dinners. Faces that had aged and then vanished. He looked for clues, something he had missed before. But the photos told the same story they always had. People smiling. People not talking. As the hours passed, something shifted inside him. What had started as curiosity hardened into focus. Then into urgency. He skipped meals without noticing. He checked the date again and again, counting days forward, then back. He wrote it down on scrap paper just to see it outside the Bible. It didn't make it feel any less real. That night, sleep refused him. He lay awake, listening to the house settle and creak, every sound magnified. When he closed his eyes, he saw ink on paper. He saw his name. By morning, exhaustion clung to him like a fog. He began to watch time. He checked clocks more often. He noticed how fast minutes slipped away. He caught himself hesitating before small decisions. Crossing the street, making a phone call, climbing the ladder in the garage. What if today was the day something went wrong? The thought scared him and the fear made him angry. This is ridiculous, he said aloud, though the empty house offered no argument. Still, he could not shake the feeling that something was moving beneath the surface. That the Bible entry was not just information, it was influence. He began to consider other explanations, ones that unsettled him even more. What if it was symbolic? What if it was a warning? What if it had been written for a reason that had nothing to do with death itself? Each possibility opened a door he didn't want to walk through. He realized then how much control the date had already taken. How it hovered over his thoughts, guiding his choices, narrowing his focus. It was no longer just a line on a page. It was shaping him. The man who had lived quietly, carefully, suddenly felt watched. By time, by history, by a hand he could not see. He returned to the Bible late that evening and ran his fingers along the margin beside his name. He didn't know why. He only knew he had to touch it, to ground himself in something solid. The paper was thin. Fragile. Just like the explanations he kept reaching for. He closed the book again, slower this time, and leaned back in his chair. His heart beat hard in his chest, each pulse a reminder that he was still here. Still alive. Yet the fear lingered, not of dying but of not understanding. Of losing control to something written long before he was ready to read it. As night settled over the house once more, he understood a truth that unsettled him deeply. Searching for meaning had not brought him peace. It had brought him closer to fear. And the closer the date came, the more tightly it seemed to hold him. The fear changed him in ways he did not notice at first. It didn't arrive as panic or sudden dread. It arrived quietly, the way most truths did in his life. It slipped into his thoughts when he was alone, when there was nothing left to distract him. In the early mornings. In the late nights. In the space between one breath and the next. The date no longer shocked him. It followed him. He stopped arguing with it and began to look at himself instead. He sat one evening at the edge of his bed, shoes still on, coat draped over a chair, staring at the floor. His reflection in the mirror caught his eye. Not just his face but the way his shoulders sagged, the way his body seemed to fold inward as if trying to take up less space in the world. He had lived carefully. Too carefully. That realization settled heavy in his chest. He thought about the relationships that had slipped through his fingers, not because he didn't care but because caring felt dangerous. There had been a woman once. Someone who laughed easily, who asked questions he avoided answering. She had wanted more than routines and safe distance. She had wanted honesty. Presence. He had given her silence instead. He remembered the moment she stopped trying. How calm she had looked when she left. How he had told himself it was for the best, that peace was better than conflict. Now, the memory felt like a bruise he had never allowed himself to touch. Family had followed the same pattern. He had loved them, of course, in his way. But love, unspoken, often sounded like absence. He thought of phone calls postponed, visits shortened, conversations kept shallow to avoid discomfort. He told himself there would be time later. The date in the Bible made that lie impossible to ignore. He realized how often he had used emotional distance as protection, how it had shielded him from pain but also from joy. He had mistaken numbness for strength, silence for stability. But numbness, he saw now, was its own kind of loss. The Bible lay open on the table again. He hadn't meant to open it, but he found himself drawn to it, as if it were a mirror he could no longer avoid. His name stared back at him, not as a sentence but as a question. What have you done with your life? The thought frightened him more than death ever had. He imagined his life ending exactly as it was, quiet, contained, unremarkable. No great harm done. No great love given either. Just a slow fading into memory recorded neatly on a page. The idea hollowed him out. He had always believed regret came from mistakes, from doing the wrong thing. But sitting there, staring at ink on paper, he understood something different. Regret came from not choosing, from avoiding, from waiting too long. The fear of the date began to shift. It no longer felt like a threat hanging over him. It felt like a spotlight, harsh and unforgiving, showing him everything he had refused to see. He had not lived badly, but he had not lived fully. And that realization broke something open inside him. Tears came without warning. Not dramatic, not loud. Just steady, honest tears he had not allowed himself in years. They surprised him with their warmth, with the relief they carried. He covered his face with his hands and breathed through it, letting the weight fall where it may. For the first time since finding the entry, he did not feel trapped by it. He felt challenged. The Bible was no longer a book of endings. It was a measure, a reminder. It did not ask when he would die. It asked how he would live before then. He wiped his face and sat there for a long time, letting the truth settle. The man he had been, the careful one, the quiet one, had done his best to survive. But survival was not the same as living. The date had forced him to confront that difference. And in doing so, it had shifted from enemy to mirror. The fear of death had faded into the background, replaced by something sharper, more urgent. The fear of reaching the end without ever opening himself to love. Without ever saying the words that mattered. Without ever choosing to step out of silence. He closed the Bible gently, not in denial this time but in understanding. Whatever the date meant, it had already done something powerful. It had shown him the life he had been avoiding. And for the first time in a long while, he felt something close to resolve. If time was limited, then silence no longer made sense. And if change was still possible, then the story written for him did not have to end the way it began. The answer did not come all at once. It arrived slowly, the way truth often does, through small details that refused to stay quiet. He returned to the Bible again the next morning, not with fear this time, but with focus. The panic that once pressed against his ribs had softened into something steadier. Determination, perhaps. Or the need to know, no matter what the knowing cost him. He opened the family record pages and studied them as a whole, not as separate entries. That was when he saw it. A pattern. At first it was subtle. Easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. Certain names had small marks beside them, tiny symbols in the margins. Not every entry. Only some. He traced one mark with his finger, then another. And then he realized what they had in common. Each of those marked names belonged to someone who had changed shortly before they died. He remembered his grandfather becoming unusually open in his final years. The man who once spoke only when necessary had begun asking questions, writing letters, sitting longer at the table after meals, saying things he had never said before. He had thought it was age. Now he wasn't so sure. He flipped to another entry, an aunt who had reconciled with her sister after decades of silence, just months before her passing. Another relative who had mended a broken relationship, settled old debts, spoken truths long buried. And each of them had something else in common. The dates beside their names had been written before they died. His breath caught. He leaned back in his chair, the weight of the realization settling heavily in his chest. These weren't records made after the fact. They were written in advance. The Bible had not been predicting death. It had been provoking change. He felt a chill, not of fear but of awe. Someone in his family had believed that knowing time was limited could wake a person up. That confronting mortality could push someone to live more honestly, more fully. And they had used the Bible to do it. not as a threat, but as a mirror. His thoughts returned to his grandfather, the quiet authority, the steady faith, the belief in responsibility over comfort. This had his fingerprints all over it. The old man had never spoken openly about death. He hadn't needed to. He had believed that action mattered more than explanation. The Bible had been his tool, a way to say what words could not. He imagined the decision it must have taken to write those dates. The care, the restraint, the hope that fear might open a door instead of closing one. The realization shifted something deep inside him. This wasn't cruelty. It was intention. Love, expressed in a way that matched the family's nature. Quiet, indirect, heavy with meaning. He returned to his own entry. His name. The date. The word. It had not been written to end his life. It had been written to interrupt it. He closed his eyes and let the truth settle. The fear he had carried for days loosened its grip, replaced by a sense of responsibility he could not ignore. The Bible had not chosen his fate. It had handed him a question. What would you do if you believed time was short? His grandfather had trusted that the answer mattered. The weight he felt now was no longer dread. It was expectation. This was not about escaping death. It was about meeting life honestly, without the shield of silence, without the excuse of later. The Bible had waited until now because now was when he was ready to see it. The thought humbled him. He understood, finally, why the book had never been opened casually. Why it had always been present but untouched. It was meant for moments like this, when routine cracked, when loss forced reflection, when a person stood still long enough to listen. The dates were not promises. They were pressure. Gentle, relentless pressure to live with intention. He rested his hand on the open page, not trembling this time. He felt sadness, for the years he had spent hiding. For the people he had loved quietly instead of boldly. But beneath that sadness was something else. Resolve. The fear that once ruled him had transformed into purpose. If his grandfather had believed this method could change lives, then perhaps it was already working. It had changed his. He closed the Bible carefully and sat back, breathing deeply. The room felt different now, not smaller but clearer. The silence that once pressed in felt less like a wall and more like space waiting to be filled. The date still mattered, but not in the way he had first believed. It was no longer an ending written in ink. It was a beginning that demanded action. And as he sat there, understanding fully for the first time what had been asked of him, he knew one thing with certainty. Whatever time he had left, he would not spend it hiding anymore. Change did not arrive all at once. It arrived awkwardly, unevenly, with hesitation. The first thing he noticed was how hard it was to act differently even after deciding to. Silence had been his language for so long that speaking now felt unnatural, almost rude. Reaching out felt like stepping into cold water, shocking, breath-stealing. Still he tried. He picked up the phone one morning and stared at the screen longer than he should have. Names scrolled past, people he had not spoken to in years, people he had convinced himself no longer mattered. Family. Old friends. A few numbers he had never deleted, even though he told himself he had moved on. His thumb hovered. What would he say? There was no script for this. No safe opening line that could undo years of distance. The thought of explaining himself made his chest tighten. But the date in the Bible sat quietly in his mind, steady and unmoving. Waiting was no longer an option. He made the call. The conversation was clumsy. Pauses stretched too long. Words came out wrong. But something else happened too, something fragile and real. The other voice stayed on the line. Listen. Didn't hang up. That small mercy felt heavier than fear ever had. From there, things began to move. He visited people instead of postponing. He stayed longer instead of watching the clock. He said things that made his voice shake. Apologies that had waited years finally found air. Forgiveness, when it came, felt almost unreal, like a gift he hadn't earned but desperately needed. Not every attempt ended well. Some doors stayed closed. Some wounds were too old. He learned quickly that change did not guarantee repair. That truth hurt more than he expected. But even failure felt different now. It felt honest. The days passed faster than he liked. Each morning he checked the date without meaning to. Each night he measured what he had done with the hours given to him. Moments took on weight. A shared meal. A long conversation. Sitting quietly with someone without needing to escape the silence. These things felt fragile, as if they could disappear if handled carelessly. He began to understand how little he had needed before, and how much he had missed. The Bible traveled with him through the house, never far from sight. Sometimes it rested on the table. Sometimes on the nightstand. He didn't open it often now. He didn't need to. Its presence was enough. It reminded him that time was not endless. That comfort was not the goal. That courage mattered. As the date grew closer, doubt crept back in. What if this wasn't enough? What if the ending was still written no matter what he did? The thought returned late at night when exhaustion softened his resolve. He wondered if dignity was the only thing left to him, if facing whatever came without fear was the real lesson. He imagined the day arriving. The quiet morning. The ordinary sky. How strange it would be if life simply stopped. But then another thought followed, steadier and stronger. If the end came, he would meet it differently than he would have before. Not hiding. Not numb. Present. Alive. That knowledge surprised him with its calm. The race he felt was not against death, he realized. It was against his old self, the man who avoided, delayed, and retreated into silence. Every choice now felt like a step away from that version of him. The pressure did not crush him. It sharpened him. Time was no longer an enemy. It was a measure. And as the date approached, he found something unexpected beneath the urgency. Gratitude. For the people who stayed. For the moments that came too late but still came. For the chance to live differently, even briefly. The Bible had not given him certainty. It had given him direction. And as he stood at the edge of the days leading up to the date written beside his name, he knew one thing with clarity that cut through every doubt. Whatever waited on the other side of that day, he would arrive there changed. The day arrived quietly. No warning. No shift in the sky. No sense of ceremony. He woke before dawn as he always did, and for a brief moment he forgot. His body followed habit, feet to the floor, hand to the light switch, breath steady. Then the thought surfaced, calm and unavoidable. This was the day. He sat on the edge of the bed and waited for fear to rush in. It didn't. Instead, there was a strange stillness. A clarity that felt almost gentle. The kind that comes after a long storm, when the air settles and everything feels sharp and clean. He dressed slowly, choosing comfort over routine. He paused longer than usual while tying his shoes, noticing the simple strength in his hands, the steady rhythm of his breathing. Each small action felt deliberate, as if it mattered more today. Time moved differently. The clock ticked, but the hours felt thick, full. Ordinary sounds stood out, the kettle warming, birds outside the window, the distant hum of traffic. He found himself paying attention in a way he never had before, as if the world had softened its voice so he could finally hear it. The Bible sat on the table. He approached it without hesitation and rested his hand on the cover. The fear that once lived there was gone. In its place was respect. Gratitude even. He did not open it. He didn't need to. Instead, he stepped outside. The morning air was cool and clean. Sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows on the ground. He stood still for a moment, letting the light touch his face, letting the day begin without rushing it. He visited places that mattered. A quiet park where he once walked with someone he loved. The bench was still there. He sat for a while, not chasing memory, just allowing it to exist. He stopped by the cemetery again, not out of fear this time, but acknowledgement. He stood before familiar stones and spoke softly, not words of regret, but of thanks. For the lives that shaped his own. For the warning that had arrived in ink instead of silence. As the hours passed, he noticed something surprising. He was not waiting for death. He was living. Each moment felt held, as if the day itself was offering him space instead of taking it away. He ate when he was hungry. He rested when he was tired. He made one last phone call, not to fix anything, not to confess, but simply to say, "I'm here." The afternoon faded into evening. Still nothing happened. No sudden pain. No collapse. No ending. As twilight settled, doubt flickered briefly in his mind. Had he misunderstood everything? Had the date lost its meaning now that it had arrived? Then, without warning, emotion surged up through him, strong, unexpected, overwhelming. It wasn't fear. It was release. The tension he had carried for so long finally let go. His chest tightened and his breath caught as tears came, not from panic, but from relief so deep it felt like grief. He sat alone in the quiet room and let it happen. The man he had been, the guarded one, the silent one, slipped away in that moment. Not violently. Not painfully. Just gently. Like something exhaled after being held too long. He understood then. The funeral had not been for his body. It had been for the life he was no longer meant to live. When the night settled fully, he felt lighter than he had in years. The fear was gone. The urgency remained, but now it felt clean, purposeful. He was still here. And he was not the same. The date had arrived. And it had passed. The understanding came slowly, like dawn after a long night. He did not wake the next morning with answers waiting for him. There was no sudden clarity, no single moment where everything made sense at once. Instead, meaning unfolded quietly, in the calm left behind after fear had passed. He sat at the dining table again, the Bible open in front of him. The page with his name no longer felt threatening. The ink had not changed. The date was still there. But what it represented had shifted completely. The funeral had already happened. Not in the way he once imagined. There had been no gathering, no mourners dressed in black, no grave waiting to be filled. What had ended was something far less visible, yet far more important. The man who lived behind silence. The man who avoided pain by avoiding connection. That was who had been laid to rest. He thought back to the days leading up to the date, the calls made, the apologies spoken, the moments of courage that had once felt impossible. None of them had erased the past, but they had changed its hold on him. He understood now that the Bible had never been predicting loss. It had been demanding honesty. The entries were not warnings of death. They were invitations to face it, to let the idea of an ending strip away excuses and force truth into the open. For his family, this had been the only language strong enough to break through generations of restraint. Silence had always ruled their lives. This was how it was challenged. He felt a quiet respect for the hand that had written the dates, for the belief that people needed to be shaken awake before they could truly choose how to live. It was a hard lesson, delivered without softness, but it came from care, not cruelty. He looked at his name again. It no longer felt like a sentence. It felt like a marker. A dividing line between who he had been and who he had chosen to become. The fear that once consumed him had lost its power. Death was still real, still inevitable, but it no longer controlled him. It no longer hovered over every thought. He accepted it the way one accepts the horizon, present, unavoidable, but not something you stare at while walking forward. Peace replaced dread. Not the kind of peace that comes from certainty, but the kind that comes from acceptance. From knowing that even if life was fragile, it was still his to live fully while it lasted. He closed the Bible and rested his hands on the cover, breathing in the quiet of the room. The house felt different now, lighter, as if something heavy had been removed from its walls. The story he had been telling himself, that his life was small, quiet, nearly finished, had been wrong. His life had not ended. It had begun again. The funeral was never meant to mark his death. It was meant to free him from fear. To close one chapter so another could finally be written. And as he sat there, calm and steady, he understood the final lesson his family had left behind. Mortality does not steal meaning. Avoidance does. He had been given a chance to choose differently. And he had. He did not rush the ending. Some things he had learned needed time to settle. The Bible remained on the table for several days after the date passed. Not because he feared it and not because he needed it close, but because it had earned its place. It had changed him. Quietly. Completely. One evening, as the light softened and the house grew still, he opened it again. Not to search. Not to confirm. But to add something. He turned carefully to the family record pages. The inked names stared back at him. Lives lived, lessons learned, endings marked with care. His own name sat there among them, no longer heavy, no longer sharp. He picked up a pen. For a long moment he hesitated. Not from fear this time, but from respect. This book had carried generations. What he added now mattered. He did not write another date of death. He wrote a line beneath his name. A simple entry. No grand explanation. Just a marker of change. A reminder that something important had happened here, not in the world but within him. When he finished, he closed the Bible gently. The sound of the cover meeting the pages felt final in the best way, like the end of a long-held breath. He carried the book back to its place on the shelf, not hiding it away, but returning it with intention. It belonged there, not as a warning but as a bridge between past and future. As the days went on, he noticed the difference in himself most clearly in small moments. He spoke more. Not loudly, not dramatically, but honestly. He reached out without rehearsing excuses. He stayed present in conversations instead of planning his escape. He allowed silence when it felt right, and broke it when it didn't. Forgiveness became easier, not because wounds had vanished, but because he no longer needed to protect himself from them. He forgave others. He forgave himself. He learned that legacy was not just what you left behind when you died. It was how you showed up while you were still here. The house no longer felt like a place of endings. It felt like a starting point. The walls still held memory, but they no longer trapped him in it. He could honor the past without living inside it. Sometimes he thought of his grandfather, of the quiet faith, the careful planning. The belief that love, when spoken plainly, could change the course of a life. He understood now that the Bible had never been about fear. It had been about courage. About choosing to live awake. On one quiet morning, he stood at the window and watched the world move. People passing, light shifting, time continuing as it always had. Nothing about the day was extraordinary. And yet, everything felt different. He was not waiting anymore. Not for permission. Not for certainty. Not for the right moment. Life had opened itself to him the moment he stopped hiding from it. The date in the Bible no longer marked an ending. It marked a decision. And that decision echoed forward, shaping every ordinary day that followed. He smiled softly, not because everything was perfect, but because it was real. Because he was present for it. Because love, once avoided, now had room to grow. The Bible remained closed. But his life did not.